My name is Anna Kawakami. I'm a first-year PhD student in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon. And today I'm really excited to share our research on improving human-AI partnerships in child welfare, understanding worker practices, challenges, and desires for algorithmic decision support. And this work is conducted alongside a great team of co-authors as shown here. AI-based decision support tools, or ADS, are increasingly deployed across complex, high-stakes decision-making contexts. For example, you may have seen recent news on the use of algorithms to assist frontline workers in social work, criminal justice, or healthcare. These tools have been introduced to these contexts with the hopes of helping to overcome limitations in human decision-making. But at the same time, AI-based judgments are themselves imperfect and biased, even if in different ways from humans. And we see growing recognition of this duality in popular discourse. For every news headline you see espousing the promise of AI to improve upon flawed human systems, there's another discussing ways AI risks making things even worse. Given the potential for humans and AI systems to build upon each other's strengths and compensate for each other's limitations, researchers have begun exploring ways to design for effective human-AI partnerships. But it remains an open question how to achieve such synergy in practice. Today, in the United States, child welfare agencies have begun to adopt ADS in their workplaces. In 2016, for example, Allegheny County's Department of Human Services deployed an algorithmic decision support tool called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, or AFST. The AFST assists social workers in making screening decisions about potential child maltreatment cases. Using large amounts of government administrative data, along with information gathered by call screeners, the AFST outputs a prediction on a scale of 1 to 20 that's meant to capture future risk of child maltreatment. We see the AFST as critical to study for multiple reasons. Beyond Allegheny County, other public sector agencies are increasingly starting to look at the AFST as an example of what AI-assisted decision-making can or should look like in child welfare. The AFST is also amongst the most studied ADS tools in HCI and ML literature. However, most existing research on the AFST and similar tools have studied the use of the tool from a distance, relying on retrospective quantitative analyses of administrative log data or online crowd experiments that simulate decision tasks but abstract away from the real context in which workers make decisions. To date, there is limited understanding of how workers actually use these kinds of tools in their day-to-day work. In this paper, we conducted an in-depth field study of workers' current practices and challenges with working with the AFST, shedding light on how a prominent algorithmic decision support tool becomes situated into the workplace over nearly half a decade of use. We asked the following questions. How do workers decide when, whether, and how much to rely upon algorithmic recommendations? What limitations and future design opportunities do workers perceive for the AFST and future ADS tools? In order to better understand workers' daily experiences working with the AFST, we visited call screeners and supervisors in their actual workplaces and conducted a total of 37.5 hours of contextual inquiries and interviews. We shadowed them as they took calls, compiled case reports, ran the AFST, and made screening recommendations or decisions. As they worked, we would occasionally ask questions to better understand their thought processes behind their actions. For example, after they made a decision, a member of our research team might ask them, "Can you walk us through how you used the AFST score to make your decision?" Through semi-structured post-interviews, we revisited moments we observed during the contextual inquiry and probed deeper into their underlying beliefs and practices with using the model. Through a series of interpretation sessions and thematic analyses, we surfaced 4 high-level themes, each capturing a key factor that guides workers' reliance on the AFST model. In the next slides, I'll briefly describe each of these, starting with this first bullet. We observed that workers use their knowledge of rich contextual information of a given case, which isn't captured by the administrative data that the model uses. We also observed that workers often compensated for gaps and limitations in the model's risk scores, using their understanding of case-specific context from allegations. For example, workers considered potential cultural misunderstandings or ulterior motives of the callers to inform the decisions around overriding a high-risk score. We also found that workers form beliefs about the ADS's capabilities and limitations relative to their own, in part informed by this contextual information. Workers in Allegheny County are intentionally given minimal information about how the AFST model works to discourage gaming behavior. However, we found that because of limited authoritative information on the model, workers improvised strategies to learn about the model on their own through their own day-to-day use. For example, workers played guessing games with their colleagues where they would gamble on what the risk score might be, honing their ability to predict the scores over time. Through learning strategies like these, workers built up their own sophisticated yet imperfect beliefs and intuitions about the model's behavior. They used these beliefs, such as the type and influence of predictive features the model uses, to calibrate their reliance on algorithmic recommendations. Given the influence workers' informal beliefs had on their use of the tool, it's unclear whether the agency's goals for limiting model transparency were actually achieved. Yet, this lack of transparency had other consequences. Overall, workers tended to be distrustful of the tool, and they didn't feel equipped to work with it effectively. We also observed that workers' decisions to rely on the algorithm were influenced by organizational pressures and incentive structures surrounding the use of the ADS. While human reliance is often discussed in the literature as a matter of trust in AI, these findings surface the importance of considering the organizational context in which the algorithm is deployed. For example, workers talked about how their organization monitored performance measures, assessing how frequently they disagreed with high algorithmic risk scores. Some described that they sometimes agreed with the high risk score against their best judgments to avoid being perceived as disagreeing with the AFST too often. Others described how they felt their expertise as human decision makers was being undervalued, given decision protocols that discouraged disagreement with the algorithmic score. Finally, workers were aware of misalignments between the algorithmic predictions and their own decision targets, and this influenced whether they relied on the ADS. Workers described that they made their decisions based on immediate safety concerns for the child. On the other hand, the model predicts the risk of out-of-home placement in 2 years. Workers described they fundamentally disagreed with, were concerned about, or did not know how to practically incorporate predictions of long-term risk into their decision-making processes. Overall, even though the AFST has been used for nearly half a decade, the system remained a source of tension for many workers. As it exists right now, the tool is perceived as a missed opportunity to effectively complement workers' own abilities as human experts. In the current literature, there are two prevailing narratives around how frontline decision-makers calibrate reliance on ADS. They are often too skeptical of useful ADS outputs, or too reliant upon erroneous or harmfully biased ADS outputs. However, our findings revealed a more complicated picture that's not fully captured by either of these two narratives. Through the 4 factors described in the prior slides, we surfaced ways in which workers navigated complex organizational and social influences in order to make case-by-case judgments that balance trade-offs across their personal decision-making values, their trust on the model, and their perceptions of how their decisions may lead to overhead consequences in their workplace. We highlight design implications cross-cutting the interface, model, and organization level. These implications are intended for researchers exploring ways to design more effective ADS, as well as public sector agencies using ADS. We also want to briefly note that the following implications are relevant only if there is good reason to believe that deploying the ADS is warranted. First, at the interface level, design interactive training interfaces that support workers in understanding the boundaries of an ADS's capabilities, like when it's more likely to err. For example, these interfaces might simulate decision-making tasks that expose workers to how differences in the model's statistical reasoning versus their own decision-making might play out in practice. While Allegheny County, along with some prior literature, cautions against providing model transparency for fear of encouraging gaming behavior, our findings challenge this concern. Lack of authoritative model information harms workers' abilities to appropriately rely on ADS. Beyond that, though, it may also cultivate an organizational culture of distrust and skepticism directed towards both agency leaders and the model itself. At the model level, involve diverse stakeholders, including frontline workers, community members, and data scientists, in co-designing an ADS's model-level design decisions. This might help reduce embedded value misalignments between the model and relevant stakeholders that could otherwise get amplified post-deployment. Also support workers in using their expertise and on-the-ground knowledge to improve an ADS's performance, for example, by providing direct feedback to inform algorithmic predictions. Finally, Building effective partnerships between workers and ADS may require an organizational culture in which workers feel their expertise as human decision makers is acknowledged and valued. Therefore, agency leaders should collaboratively determine with workers themselves how decision-making power should be distributed across the ADS and workers, as well as how good decision-making should be evaluated through performance measures. So our research on this paper focused on providing a broader understanding of workers' practices around calibrating reliance on the AFST. If you're interested in understanding the specific fairness-related practices and implications, please check out our other paper led by Cheng and Logan Stapleton, How Child Welfare Workers Reduce Racial Disparities in Algorithmic Decisions, also published in CHI 2022. Finally, we'd like to acknowledge and thank the call screeners and supervisors in Allegheny County for their time and valuable input that shaped this research. We'd also like to thank leadership and analysts at Allegheny County for their strong commitment to transparency and welcoming in external researchers to closely observe their practices. And we hope this openness towards research collaboration will become a norm more broadly across public sectors using ADS. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. Please do reach out if you're interested in chatting, and I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Testing? All right. So while we wait for some questions from the audience, we have time for a couple. I'll ask one. I wonder if you, in your design thinking and in your evaluation and assessment of the situation, you considered ways to make the case workers think about the consequences of their actions. So it's almost like a what-if tool for their decisions, regardless of if it is something they decide to do with the machine learning assistance or not. I mean, seeing what the consequences of their actions may lead to may give them an interesting way of weighing the consequences of errors. So I wondered if that is something that was discussed on your observations or something you've been thinking on.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think there's multiple aspects of that we could comment on. First off, we did explore some design interfaces as a way to further probe workers' challenges, and we did ask about their desire for feedback on their decisions. It looks like you're asking about whether they want feedback on their decisions and also whether they want interfaces that show immediate consequences of their decisions.
Right. I mean, ultimately, a child's life is being affected by that decision, it is not a light decision.
Right. What was interesting was that while some workers were interested in this type of feedback on the impacts of their decisions, others also argued that because they make sometimes 20s to hundreds of decisions every single day, they didn't have the mental capacity or the bandwidth to actually observe and see the consequences of how their decisions led to certain outcomes. They also commented on how after they make a decision, there are many other decisions that are made afterwards, like the investigator might go into the home and that investigator, a separate social worker, makes another decision about whether services are offered or not. And so they felt like any type of feedback would not be directly tied onto their actual decision they made on that particular day or time. But we also probed their interest on interfaces, and this is written in a separate paper, so if you're interested, it'll be published in this 2022. But anyways, we also probed their interest in interfaces that showed similar cases as a way for them to see how past decisions were made on these similar cases. But what we found was that workers didn't want to see similar cases because they said that each case is unique, and so it really doesn't make sense for them to compare across cases and say this case is similar to this case because of these limited set of factors that have similarities.
Makes sense. Thank you. And we have a question from the audience. If you can state your name and affiliation.
Hi, this is Snehal Prabhudesai from the University of Michigan. Great talk, Anna. I really enjoyed listening to it, especially the part about, so I guess the thing I liked the most was investigating decision-making in high-stakes scenarios. And my question on that is, you said that the landscape is not too simple, like over-reliance or under-reliance, and it's more complicated. Were there any cases where the algorithm was giving an extremely wrong prediction? And then in that case, what was the behavior of these decision makers? Were they trying to, I guess, negotiate with the algorithm in some ways, or still rely on themselves to make the right choice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and hello again, it's nice seeing you. Yeah, so we definitely observed and heard about occurrences in which the workers knew that the algorithm was wrong because they noticed patterns over time about what types of characteristics and cases led to wrong predictions. So for example, if a child was frequently involved with child services in the past, even if it wasn't involved in a serious or severe case, the risk score tended to be higher just because that's how the model was trained. And so they did notice these cases, and what they did depended on the specific case, but there were certain factors that I can speak about that influence how they made their decision. So I guess give you a bit of an overview of how call screeners made their decisions. The algorithmic risk score is just one source of information they use to inform their decisions. Besides that, they also get allegations from call screeners and other administrative data, and then they make algorithmic recommendations, and then all of that information gets sent to the supervisors who then make the final decision. And so if the algorithm was wrong because it was too high, high algorithmic risk predictions are under this like high risk protocol process within the agency in which the case gets sent to like a high risk protocol, so you have to physically like override the decision. And because of that extra step of having to override it, sometimes workers were less likely to override the decision because, of the system that was put in place. Other times, workers were willing to override the decision. And it kind of seemed to depend on, I guess, the severity of the case, their belief that, how strong their belief that the algorithmic score was wrong, as well as their fear of like overhead consequences of, am I overriding cases too often this month? Maybe I didn't override enough or maybe I didn't override a lot of cases this month, so it's okay if I override this one. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Okay.
Thank you to our speaker. We need to keep the presentation moving along. There's the one question online that I will invite you to take a look at. It's a good one, so don't miss it. So let's switch gears.